All right, so in order to define this internal culture or this new culture of the United States, we've looked at a shared history. We have looked at how the elite circles should be with the president and the first lady. And another one that we see is some things like Noah Webster. So, Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionary attempted to create a language whose purity and simplicity would reflect and sustain American virtue and independence. Webster believed that independence could not be achieved until uh, complete independence, in that sense of not relying on another country for anything, was gained. And this included a unique language that Americans could speak and write. So what he did was he created the American Speller, which was a small book. Yeah, it included like American national heroes, places, etc. If you ever get your hands on one of these, they're really neat. I was cleaning out my great aunt's house a couple years ago and came across one of these in her things. But these little books also included like moral lessons for children, things like sin will lead us to pain and woe. And they gradually became more complex in stories about obedience, industry, and patriotism as the child got older and more advanced in their education. So Webster thought that reform in spelling to could could in essence create that unique language rather than completely walking away from the British language. Let's just create some unique spelling things rather than a whole entire language. Now, Benjamin Franklin, on the other hand, Benjamin Franklin, he worked on a new alphabet. He wanted to simplify spelling, regularize. I'm sorry, I just completely got tripped up on that word. English spelling. So at this time, a lot of times, letters would go back and forth, and nobody spelled anything the same way. So a lot of times people would say, you can't, a person's not trustworthy if they spelled the same word the same twice. But Benjamin Franklin thought that everything should be completely new and that spelling should be the same across. Another thing to come out of this was, how do we then in turn teach this new this new culture? So you have these unique colonies that are trying to come together to be one. How do we teach these things in the future? So civic virtue becomes one of the ways in which to teach a new culture. And civic virtue will have two angles. One is for men and one is for women. And they are split along gender lines. But in this situation, if we look at female civic virtue, it was gained through female education, and this was Noah Webster said, "In all nations, a good education is that which renders the ladies correct in their manners, respectable in their families, and agreeable in society. That education is always wrong which raises a woman above the duties of her station." Now, Benjamin Rush, who is the guy in the center of your screen there, he believed that women must be a good companion for their husbands and a mother to their sons. So he believed that they should completely be educated, because to be a good wife, they should be able to speak with their husbands about things of importance. So he started the Young Ladies Academy of Philadelphia, and he wanted all women to be able to read. Writing was an element of this, and also things like ornamental accomplishments. Now, ornamental accomplishments are things like fine needle stitching, things like that. But he also taught the principles of liberty. He taught them how the government worked, and not so much for a self-realization or a self-fulfillment, but more to be able to teach future American boys, which becomes the notion of Republican motherhood. And if you are keeping notes, you need to note the Republican motherhood, because these women will take it upon themselves to teach the Republican virtues to their sons. So civic virtue is a willingness to sacrifice self-interest for the good of all. I mentioned a minute ago that civic virtue is split between gender lines. So you've got the females part of it is where she is a good companion, and she can teach those things to her future children, especially her sons. But for a man, it was the willingness to sacrifice self-interest for the good for all. Um, Benjamin Rush said, "Let our pupil be taught that he does not belong to himself, but that he is public property. Let him be taught to love his family, but let him be taught at the same time that he must forsake and even forget them when the welfare of his country requires it. He must love private life, meaning his wife, and his children, but he must disdain, but he must decline, um, not station, however public or responsible it may be when called to it by the suffrages of his fellow citizen. Above all, he must love life and endure to acquire as many of its conveniences as possible by industry and economy, that he must be taught that this life is not his own when the safety of his country requires it." So it's okay for him to want to love life and want to acquire things and be successful in his business. But when it comes time for war, he must walk away from that. Teaching civic virtue in a unified public school system also somewhat combated the diverse cultural differences within the United States, and it did help immigrants learn how to become U.S. citizens. But during this time, I mean, if you're a farmer in the middle of nowhere, you're really not going to have a public school system to go to. So a lot of women and men teach their children these virtues at home. So we have the internal conflict of the United States, really, really hardcore, of struggling with this new culture, how they're going to teach it, and how that's all going to happen. But there's also an internal conflict of solidifying the government. So your second internal conflict is solidifying the government. So agriculture, I mean, cotton, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we have this economical boom. Transportation is really booming because roads are being built to really connect all these places together, which generates employment and trade. And there needs to be some economic protection for banking. So the first bank of the United States is Alexander Hamilton's. It's one of his many brainchildren. And this comes about in 1791. The first Bank of the United States was a cornerstone in Hamilton's fiscal policy. It helped fund the public debt left from the American Revolution and facilitated the issuance of a stable national currency. It provided a convenient means for exchange for all people of the United States, and it was capitalized at about $10 million. Fully subscribed almost instantly, with the federal government holding the largest block of ownership in this, which was about 20%. And a substantial interest in the bank was also purchased by European investors. The bank accomplished all that Hamilton had hoped for and also succeeded in an unforeseen role, which served as the regulation of private banks chartered by several states. At this time, the issuance of notes was more of a conspicuous feature of banking than were deposits. So it tended to be more of a regularizing those notes than people coming and putting money in them. Banknotes entered circulation as the money as banks lent it out to borrowers. And these notes constituted most of the total currency in circulation. The rapid growth of the young country generated powerful demands for loans and tended to stimulate the overextension of credit. So one of the problems that we see with this is that it really did kind of stretch money kind of thin, and that it was constantly giving out money. It was in the general interest to restrain such overexpansion, and the bank imposed that restraint automatically. So it also serves as this way of saying, okay, you guys are giving out way too much money. Let's pull this back. Despite its successes, the bank met political opposition, and that we'll look at in a few minutes why that happens. And you've got these notions of federalist and anti-federalist being one of the issues. So, in a large part, this opposition was based on the very restraints that the bank imposed on private state chartered banks, and this was also seen as as kind of getting in the way of that whole states' rights thing. So, if you've got banks, let's kind of back this up and explain this. So, you have banks in individual states who are issuing these notes in the form of loans, and they issued them so much that they're giving all this money out, but they're not really taking anything back in return in deposits. So it really overextends. So what the First Bank of the United States does is it kind of regulates the banks in those states who are overextending and giving out too many notes. And there were some people, Thomas Jefferson being one of the main ones here, who will say that the bank is unconstitutional. The Constitution did not say anything about a national bank, that it infringes on states' rights, and so therefore it can't happen. So when the charter comes up in 1811, after 20 years, it was politically impossible to renew this because of the people who were in the government. So it does it will serve as, it will have its place as we move forward later on regulations, but for now they're unable to renew that after 1811. Another one of our internal conflicts is the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton understood that the federal government needed a way to make steady income. So we've got Hamilton with the bank. Now we've got Hamilton coming in somewhere else. So they need to make steady money. They need to be self-sufficient. So he puts an excise tax on whiskey. In other words, it's a tax that is built into the price. So today, if you go buy gas, say gas is $2.23, there's a tax already built in to that price that you're paying per gallon. So that's kind of what he's looking at here. Congress passed this tax in 1791 that said that they could tax whiskey. Most citizens obviously are going to feel very negative about this tax. Now, really think about this. You get to the heart of the Revolutionary War. One of the things that kicks that thing off is that tax that was put on molasses coming in, even though it was a lesser tax than what had originally been there. And if you look at this, people are kind of a little bit, they're a little leery of how this government's going to go for them at the beginnings of this republic. And the farmers of Western Pennsylvania were just flat out outraged by this tax. Even Washington, I mean, he had distilleries. That's one of the things that he did. So in 1794, they attacked the house of a tax collector. They threatened to spread to other states. Hamilton advocated to send in federal troops. Does this sound familiar? I mean, this is for kind of verbatim as to what we've seen, except for a much smaller scale. Washington instead says, we're not going to send out federal troops. We'll put state militias on standby and put negotiators on the issue. And when negotiations failed, Hamilton and Virginia Governor Henry Lee marched 13,000 militia into Pennsylvania. By the time the troops got there, the majority of the rebels had fled. 2 men were convicted of treason, and later Washington pardoned them. So where Washington says, okay, I'm not going to send federal troops in here. We can send in some state militias if needed. I'm not going to send in the federal government. He really did set a precedent on how things would be handled in the future over things like that. All right, so we have pretty well established our internal conflicts with the culture, with how to run this nation, how to tax things, how to build state banks. We're going to look at some external conflicts when we come back that will have some influences on the United States.